Imagine being the fastest growing company in America. Your products are in millions of homes. You're generating $2 billion in annual revenue. Wall Street analysts call you unstoppable. And then in just 12 months, you lose over $500 million, bury millions of products in a desert landfill, and trigger an industry-wide collapse so devastating that revenues plummet 97%. This isn't a hypothetical disaster scenario. This actually happened to Atari in 1983, and the warning signs were there all along. What you're about to hear is the story of how corporate greed, impossible deadlines, and catastrophic decision-making transformed the king of video games into a cautionary tale that still echoes through business schools today. Because when Atari fell, they didn't just destroy their own company. They nearly killed an entire industry. And the person who eventually saved gaming? It wasn't even an American company. Before we dive into one of the most spectacular corporate collapses in history, I need to ask you something. If you appreciate deep dives into the business decisions that changed our world, the kind of stories most people slept through while they were happening, hit that like button and subscribe to the Sleeping Economist. Because these financial mysteries, they're just getting started. Now, let's talk about Atari. Chapter 1. When Genius Met Money. In 1972, a ponytailed engineer named Nolan Bushnell launched a company called Atari in Sunnyvale, California. The name came from the Japanese game Go. It meant you're about to be engulfed. It's prophetic when you think about what eventually happened. Bushnell's first major success was Pong, that deceptively simple tennis game that became a cultural phenomenon. 2 paddles, 1 ball, addictive gameplay. Pong machines started appearing in bars, bowling alleys, and pizza parlors across America. People lined up with quarters. The company was printing money. But Bushnell had bigger dreams. He wanted to bring arcade games into people's homes. The problem? Developing a home console system required serious capital, money Atari didn't have. By 1976, despite Pong's success, the company was skirting bankruptcy. They needed a buyer, and they needed one fast. Enter Warner Communications, the media conglomerate that would eventually become Time Warner. They saw potential in this scruffy gaming startup and purchased Atari for $28 million in October 1976. For Bushnell, who'd started the company with just $500, it seemed like a win. He personally walked away with $15 million. But the deal changed everything about Atari's DNA. Suddenly, the company wasn't run by creative engineers who loved games. It was run by executives in New York who loved quarterly earnings reports. Warner pumped $100 million into Atari, giving them the resources to finish developing their home console, the Atari Video Computer System, later renamed the Atari 2600. Released in 1977, the 2600 let people play multiple games using interchangeable cartridges. This was revolutionary. Before this, home consoles could only play one game. The 2600 changed everything. The system exploded when Atari secured the home rights to Space Invaders in 1980. That single game quadrupled console sales overnight. People bought the Atari 2600 just to play Space Invaders at home. By 1982, Atari's annual sales had rocketed from $75 million in 1977 to over $2 billion. That's not a typo. $2 billion. Atari accounted for half of Warner Communications' entire revenue. The company employed 10,000 people. Financial magazines called them the fastest growing company in American history. But here's what nobody wanted to acknowledge. The explosive growth was built on an unsustainable foundation. Third-party developers, competitors who created games for the Atari 2600 without Atari's permission or quality control, were flooding the market with mediocre products. Retail shelves overflowed with games, and Warner's executives, intoxicated by those massive revenue numbers, made decisions that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. The crash was coming. They just didn't see it yet. Chapter 2. When Greed Overrode Judgment. By 1982, the video game industry had become a gold rush, and everyone wanted a piece. Companies that had never made games before suddenly started producing cartridges for the Atari 2600. Quaker Oats made a game, so did Purina. Yes, the pet food company. There was no quality control, no barrier to entry. Anyone could manufacture a cartridge and get it onto store shelves. The market became saturated with garbage. Games that were barely playable. Games that crashed. Games that made no sense. Consumers started getting burned. They'd pay $40 or $50 for a cartridge that turned out to be completely unplayable, but they kept buying because the Atari 2600 was the only game in town. Literally, there were no real competitors yet. Inside Atari, the culture was shifting. The creative engineers who'd built the company were becoming disillusioned. They weren't getting credit for their work. Atari didn't even put developer names on the games. And despite creating products that generated millions in revenue, these programmers were paid modest salaries while executives in New York collected massive bonuses. In 1979, 4 of Atari's best developers quit and formed their own company, Activision. This was revolutionary. Activision became the first third-party developer, creating high-quality games for the Atari 2600 while giving their programmers credit and better compensation. Atari sued them, arguing that only Atari should be allowed to make games for Atari's console. They lost. The floodgates opened wider. By late 1982, Warner Communications was pressuring Atari to maintain those incredible growth numbers. Wall Street analysts expected continued expansion. Stock prices depended on it, executive bonuses depended on it, so when the opportunity arose to secure the video game rights to one of the biggest movies of the year, Atari didn't hesitate. Steven Spielberg's E.T., the extraterrestrial, had become a cultural phenomenon, grossing nearly $800 million worldwide. Atari's CEO, Ray Kassar, negotiated with Spielberg for the exclusive rights to create an E.T. video game. The deal cost Atari somewhere between $20 and $25 million, the most expensive video game license in history at that point. Here's where the disaster began. The negotiations dragged on so long that by the time Atari secured the rights, it was July 1982. They wanted the game ready for Christmas, the peak shopping season. That gave them less than 6 months. In the video game industry, even back then, 6 months was considered rushed. Quality games typically took 8 to 12 months to develop. But Kassar didn't care about timelines. He cared about Christmas sales. He told his team to make it happen. And that's when they called Howard Scott Warshaw, one of Atari's most talented programmers, into a meeting that would change gaming history. Chapter 3: 5 Weeks to Disaster. Howard Scott Warshaw was riding high in July 1982. He'd just created Raiders of the Lost Ark for the Atari 2600, another Spielberg property, and it had been a massive success. So when Kassar personally called him in for a meeting, Warshaw expected praise. What he got instead was an impossible assignment. "We need you to create the E.T. game," Kassar told him. "Steven Spielberg specifically requested you." For any game developer, having Spielberg request you by name was the ultimate compliment. Warshaw was honored. Then Kassar dropped the timeline. "We need it done by September 1st. That gives manufacturing enough time to produce cartridges for Christmas." Warshaw did the math in his head. September 1st was 5 weeks away. 5 weeks to design, program, test, and deliver a complete video game. It was insane. Industry standard was 6 to 9 months. Even rushed games took 3 to 4 months minimum. Warshaw told Kassar it was impossible. Kassar didn't want to hear it. He offered Warshaw extra compensation, resources, whatever he needed. But the timeline was non-negotiable. Christmas was non-negotiable. The shareholders expected a blockbuster E.T. game under their Christmas trees. Warshaw, caught between professional pride and impossible demands, said yes. It was the biggest mistake of his career. For 5.5 weeks, Warshaw worked around the clock. He met with Spielberg, who suggested the game should be about empathy and connection, themes that were nearly impossible to translate into the limited hardware of the Atari 2600. Warshaw tried his best, creating a game where E.T. had to collect pieces of a telephone to phone home, while avoiding government agents and falling into pits. The problem was complexity. Warshaw tried to create something innovative, something that matched Spielberg's vision. But he didn't have time to playtest properly. He didn't have time to refine the mechanics. He barely had time to debug the code. The game was confusing, frustrating, and often unplayable. E.T. would fall into pits repeatedly, with unclear mechanics for escaping. Players didn't understand the objectives, and it wasn't fun. Warshaw knew it wasn't ready, but September 1st arrived and he delivered what he had. Atari's executives looked at the game, saw that it technically functioned, and sent it to manufacturing. They didn't do extensive playtesting. They didn't wait for player feedback. They just started producing cartridges. Millions of cartridges. Here's the truly catastrophic decision. Atari manufactured somewhere between 4 and 5 million ET cartridges. Some estimates go as high as 7 million. For context, there were only about 10 million Atari 2600 consoles in homes at that point. Atari was betting that nearly half of all Atari owners would buy this game. They were so confident, they were already counting the revenue. Chapter 4. When everything collapsed. E.T. the Extraterrestrial launched in December 1982, just in time for Christmas. The initial sales looked promising. Atari sold about 1.5 million copies in the first few weeks. But then something unprecedented happened. The returns started flooding in. Consumers hated the game. They found it confusing, frustrating, and broken. Gaming magazines published scathing reviews. Word of mouth spread quickly. Parents who'd bought E.T. for their kids demanded refunds. Retailers, stuck with massive unsold inventory, demanded that Atari buy back the cartridges. The game became a punchline. Late-night comedians joked about it. It was publicly, spectacularly, humiliatingly bad. But E.T. wasn't the only problem. The entire market was collapsing simultaneously. Remember all those third-party developers flooding the market with terrible games? Consumers finally hit their breaking point. They stopped trusting video games entirely. Why pay $40 for something that might be garbage? Retailers, looking at warehouses full of unsold cartridges, stopped ordering new inventory. Some stores started marking down games to $5 or $10 just to clear shelf space. Atari's 1982 Christmas season, the one they'd bet everything on, turned into a financial bloodbath. They'd manufactured millions of cartridges for multiple games. E.T., Pac-Man, another critically panned port, and various others. The vast majority sat unsold. By early 1983, Atari had warehouses packed with unsold inventory, representing hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. In December 1982, Warner Communications announced that Atari's growth had slowed. Wall Street panicked. Warner's stock price plummeted, losing hundreds of millions in market value in a single day. It was one of the largest single-day drops in stock market history at that time. The numbers got worse. In 1983, Atari reported losses of $536 million. Warner Communications' total loss for the year was $417 million. Yes, Atari's losses were larger than the parent company's losses, meaning Atari was dragging down Warner's other profitable divisions. The company laid off 3,000 employees, nearly a third of their workforce. Offices closed, projects were cancelled. The fastest growing company in America had become a financial crater. The question everyone asked was, what do you do with millions of unsold video game cartridges? In September 1983, Atari made a decision that became legend. They loaded 14 truckloads of unsold games, E.T., Pac-Man, and others, and drove them to a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico. There, using bulldozers, they crushed the cartridges and buried them under layers of concrete and dirt. For years, people thought this was an urban legend. It seemed too bizarre to be true. But in 2014, documentary filmmakers excavated the site and found them. Thousands of crushed E.T. cartridges, exactly where Atari had buried them 31 years earlier. Physical evidence of one of the worst business decisions in American corporate history. Chapter 5. How the industry nearly died. Atari's collapse didn't happen in isolation. The entire North American video game industry imploded. This period, 1983 to 1985, became known as the video game crash, and the statistics were apocalyptic. Industry revenues dropped from $3.2 billion in 1983 to about $100 million by 1985. That's a 97% collapse in 2 years. Major retailers like Toys R Us and KB Toys dramatically reduced their video game sections or eliminated them entirely. They'd been burned too many times by returned merchandise and unsold inventory. Many retailers declared video games a fad that had run its course, like pet rocks or hula hoops. The shelf space that had been devoted to cartridges was replaced with action figures and board games. Video game companies collapsed one after another. Mattel shut down their Intellivision division after losing $338 million. Coleco, maker of the ColecoVision, filed for bankruptcy. Magnavox discontinued their Odyssey line. Activision, the company founded by former Atari developers, barely survived by pivoting to computer games. The entire infrastructure of game development, retail, and distribution disintegrated. Warner Communications, desperate to stop the bleeding, tried to sell Atari. But who wanted to buy a company synonymous with catastrophic failure? In 1984, they finally found a buyer. Jack Tramiel, the former CEO of Commodore Computers, purchased Atari's consumer division for a reported $50 million in company stocks and assets, a fraction of the $2 billion in annual revenue Atari had generated just 2 years earlier. Tramiel split Atari into two companies, Atari Corporation, consumer products, and Atari Games, an arcade division. Neither would recapture the glory days. Atari Corporation eventually shifted focus to personal computers, making the Atari ST series, which found modest success in Europe. The Atari brand would be sold, resold, and passed through multiple corporate hands over the coming decades, eventually becoming little more than a nostalgic logo licensing company. Meanwhile, developers like Howard Scott Warshaw left the industry. Warshaw, who'd been blamed publicly for E.T.'s failure despite the impossible timeline, eventually became a psychotherapist in Silicon Valley. In interviews decades later, he'd reflect on the experience with remarkable grace, noting that he'd done the best he could under circumstances that were designed to fail. But here's the most painful part of Atari's story. They had a chance to survive. In the early 1980s, a Japanese company approached them with a revolutionary new console. This company had learned from Atari's mistakes. They'd built quality controls into their system, ensuring that only approved games that met certain standards, could be played on their console. They wanted to partner with Atari to distribute this console in North America. Atari dismissed them. The company was Nintendo. Chapter 6. What Atari's ghost still teaches us. Let's talk about what we can learn from Atari's catastrophic collapse, because these lessons are just as relevant today as they were in 1983. First, explosive growth without sustainable foundations is a house of cards. Atari went from $75 million to $2 billion in 5 years. That growth impressed investors and analysts, but it masked fundamental problems. They had no quality control. They had no long-term product strategy. They were running on momentum and market dominance, assuming competitors would never catch up. Second, corporate cultures that prioritize quarterly earnings over creative excellence will destroy themselves. Warner Communications executives forced impossible timelines because they were obsessed with hitting Christmas sales targets. They didn't care that 5 weeks was insufficient to create a quality game. They cared about the revenue projection in their quarterly report. This short-term thinking generated immediate numbers while demolishing long-term value. Third, market saturation kills brands. In 1982, there were hundreds of games for the Atari 2600, and most of them were terrible. Atari didn't control their ecosystem, so third parties flooded the market with low-quality products that damaged consumer trust in the entire platform. Compare this to Nintendo's strategy a few years later. They required developers to submit games for approval, limited how many titles a developer could release per year, and maintain strict quality standards. Fourth, impossible deadlines produce impossible failures. Howard Scott Warshaw was a talented programmer, but nobody could create a quality game in 5 weeks. Management knew this. They just didn't care. They believed willpower and pressure could overcome reality. This is magical thinking, and it pervades corporate culture even today. When executives set impossible timelines, they're not being ambitious, they're being delusional. Fifth, ignoring warning signs because they're inconvenient doesn't make them go away. Atari executives saw the returns coming in. They saw the negative reviews. They heard from developers that the timelines were impossible. They received warnings from retailers about market saturation. They ignored all of it because acknowledging the problems would have meant missing earnings targets. Finally, the most expensive lesson, knowing when to partner rather than dominate. Atari dismissed Nintendo's approach because they couldn't imagine sharing power or learning from competitors, especially a Japanese toy company. That arrogance cost them the future. Nintendo went on to sell 62 million NES consoles worldwide, dominating gaming for a decade. Atari became a footnote. Today, in 2026, Atari exists only as a brand licensing company, trading on nostalgia. But the lessons from their collapse about sustainable growth, quality control, respecting creative timelines, and maintaining ecosystem integrity, those lessons live on. Every time a company prioritizes short-term stock prices over long-term product excellence, they're walking the same path Atari walked. And that path leads to a landfill in New Mexico. If stories like this fascinate you, where we uncover the economic events that shaped our world while most people weren't paying attention, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we're just getting started with these financial, educational mysteries.